Just how much will Africa's political landscape change in 2011? The world's second largest continent has some key elections coming up, with a referendum in its biggest nation, Sudan, coming up on January the 9th. What are the implications if the country splits into two? Plus, two of Africa's longest-serving leaders face the vote, with Egypt and Zimbabwe set for presidential elections. Will there be disputes like we have seen in Côte d'Ivoire? Will Somalia's Western-backed transitional federal government deliver at last? And just how far has Africa progressed towards its Millennium Development Goals? Join Africa Today for a preview of key African events in 2011.
2011 is a crucial year for the world's second-largest continent, Africa. Among its major events are elections in Egypt, Zimbabwe, Nigeria and Sudan's referendum. The continent has suffered less coup d'etats in recent times, and these elections are indications of its maturity. The economy is set to even grow bigger in 2011. The International Monetary Fund has raised its forecast for Africa as a result of the continent's higher commodity prices and government stimulus programs. These results have helped it from the effects of global recession, which is set to continue in 2011. Currently, Africa holds about 9% of the world's proven oil reserves, and this could increase significantly as more reserves are being discovered. Also, about 50% of the world's diamonds come from Africa, while gold accounts for a similar percentage. With competition from Africa's resources growing and key political events imminent, Africa Today looks at how the continent will deal with these challenges in the new year.
Happy New Year and welcome to Africa Today with me, Vuyiswa Ngobongwana. Indeed, it is a crucial year ahead for the African continent. Election fever seems to be very much on people's minds, with the earliest coming up on January the 9th in Sudan's referendum. It looks like the country will split into two, but is this good news? Plus, Zimbabwe faces its own self-examination. Are its elections a gathering political storm, as a recent BBC article claimed? Here with me to share their thoughts and speculations on what 2011 might hold for Africa are Dr. Togo Kaime, who is the Deputy Director of the Surrey International Law Centre, and Ms. Thandiwe Makiwane, a political and community activist based here in London. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa Today, and a Happy New Year to you both.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
If I could start with you, Togo, Mugabe. Here we go. It's been a long time since the promise of the end of Chimurenga, in those heady days when so much was expected of him. Do you feel finally the sun will set for him?
Well, I think this is a moment for Mugabe to show his true leadership. There's been a lot of criticism, not just from within Zimbabwe, but also within the Southern African community. And I think that this time we'll see a reaction to that criticism. Within SADC itself, we've seen leaders breaking ranks and start describing situations for what they are. And I think that as we run up to these forthcoming elections in Zimbabwe, that criticism will now start to make an impact.
I mean, we're talking about a relatively short period of time. It's April that things will build up to hopefully a non-violent conclusion. But Thandi, do you think really that Mugabe will let go of the reins of power?
I am less optimistic than that. I think there are a lot of interplays in Southern Africa particularly. There is always the third factor of the settler colonial group and the land question. Now Mugabe has probably used that to its ultimate, and maybe your optimistic view that now SADC is going to push him to actually take forward the fact that he is not young, and two, we do need Zimbabwe up and coming. So we are all hopeful that that will happen. But at the end of the day, what leaders have we got to take that vacuum? That is very important.
Well, what about the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai?
I don't know. I don't know much about Tsvangirai. We've heard a lot about Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And anyway, we don't want another dictatorship. we're not just automatically assuming that if he resigns, then Tsvangirai takes over. We want to see dialogue and open voices discussing in Africa. We don't just want to say, oh, this one was bad, let's get another one that we know.
But I mean, we're talking about the democratic process playing out. I mean, if you could say generally about the whole African continent, you know, first of all, after independence, a revolutionary leader gets to the top, and suddenly, to some analysts, just appears to be the exact opposite of what he promised. But isn't that just part of the evolution of the democratic process, that, you know, we have to get used to the idea that democracy is not
easy.
It's not easy, but it's also got to have an African character. You know, do you think that the Zimbabwe situation can actually help to illustrate that in this coming year?
When you describe democracy as having an African character, I tend to be a bit uncomfortable with that, because democracy ought to be the same everywhere, and this means that the view of the people must be respected. Now, in the last election in Zimbabwe, we had a situation where the returning officers indicated that the opposition had won. All right? Now, the opposition had won, but because of the people that hold the purse strings, the military and all that, Mugabe was able to keep in power.
You could just exactly be talking about Nigeria, which we have to move on to, because it's a quick sweep, you know. That's what I'm talking about, the African character, the legacy of colonialism, the problem of tribal links between groups and loyalties, and so on and so forth. I mean, do you think that the Nigerians will be able to step out of the shadow of corruption?
It's going to take a few generations. This is a problem that is systemic within the African state. The states that we're bequeathed with have got in them this ability to perpetuate corruption. And I think that it will take a few generations for Nigeria to step out of that particular shadow.
How do you feel, Sistani? I mean, Nigeria has got so much potential in terms of energy, the number of people there. And some people, Gaddafi was saying in 2010 that the best solution is just split the place into two, similar to what may happen in Sudan. I mean, how do you feel they'll manage to actually initiate their democratic process? Because there's been a lot of exposure of the corruption, of the links with the West, in the banking sector, and generally speaking. So do you think that this exposure will help the democratic process?
I think it's very difficult. I cannot see. I mean, I agree with Toka. I cannot really see immediately that we are going to change. Nigeria has got, if any country in Africa has got potential, it is Nigeria. It's got a large population, quite a large population of very well-educated people, but it's got resources within.
Yes.
And so therefore it's got technical skills and abilities. Yeah. But unfortunately, I hate to have to always go back to this thing colonial, but unfortunately the patchwork of how these countries were made makes it always a big issue, because Nigeria has got a very huge part of the north that is very much that is the Muslim population. And that is very, very separated from what happens in the south. And a lot of the conflict have always got to do with those dynamics.
Well, very briefly, literally seconds. I mean, it looks like Mubarak will continue, or in some form or other, whether it's through his son or some other mechanism. How do you feel that will impact the continent?
Well, it's again about precedents, and I think that we are not stepping out of this shadow of democracy, but just in its form, not really substantively. And we can see that across, in Ivory Coast, we've seen that in Zimbabwe, and we've seen that in Kenya. I mean, winning an election does not guarantee that you'll be in power. The old settlements still continue.
But also the method of winning the election also can guarantee that you're in power, because there's manipulation, which some analysts think Mubarak is an expert at.
Yes.
Right, well...
And there are good stories. We shouldn't be so pessimistic. We saw the elections this last year in Tanzania, where they had a settlement on Zanzibar, reacting to past situations where people were dying from during run-ups to elections. But now we have a settlement which seemed to have worked well. There was no death on Zanzibar last year.
Right.
So it is possible that we'll see some positive change in some places.
Okay, and also there's a smaller number of coup d'etats in 2010. I mean, is that an indicator of something for the future?
To a certain extent, I do think it is. I mean, if you look at the Millennium Goals, there was actually positive. Up to 2009, Africa tried. So therefore, there were improvements in governance and improvement in other things. And probably that prompted the less coup d'etats. I don't know. Because people are becoming more aware and more sort of voicing their own views a bit more.
Sure.
So we hope then that's the beginning of less and less conflict.
Yes. Time will tell. I mean, we are going to move on, and one of Africa's most famous leaders says that change is a process rather than an event. So perhaps we need to actually look at the patterns that are evolving and not be so depressed about how long it may be taking. But we're going to move our discussion on to discuss the perennial pain that is Somalia and the coming referendum in the Sudan. Plus, how well has Africa done in its progress towards the Millennium Development Goals? First up, a chance to hear what you've been saying to us throughout 2010. Thank you so much for emailing us. Let's have a look at what an unidentified person in Zimbabwe said earlier on last year. This person said, for Zimbabwe's problems to go away, President Mugabe and his team must go. Unfortunately, Mugabe, is wielding the axe on anyone wanting him to go. Also talking about another seemingly isolated part of Africa, which is Eritrea. Robel G. Fukada says, regarding the seeming isolation of Eritrea, actually Eritrea is not isolated. Eritrea enjoys friendship with many states in the region, and it's actually working hard to empower its economy through investing in projects that help its people and trying to build its country, and we are successfully doing that. Moving on to our Facebook page, Macham in Nigeria wrote, it's not just in Nigeria but all around Africa, mostly in countries where oil is produced. I don't understand why we can't have and create our own system to work for us rather than depending on old systems which don't favor us. Chuks, also located in Nigeria, thought, it's appalling that African leaders think they own the countries they govern. They treat it as a source of income for themselves and their families. It's time for change. Moving on to text messages, Pa Kwesi, living in Ghana, wrote, it's rather unfortunate that the Somali situation is diverting attention from what is truly needed for rapid development on the continent. The money being used on peacekeeping in Somalia can be used to help eradicate poverty in some areas of Africa. And still talking about Somalia, Lepang, living in the UK, thinks, we know the real root causes of the Somali conflict. There are now different forces like Uganda pushing forward their agendas. Political solution is the only way forward in resolving the Somali crisis. Indeed, that email from Lepang brings us very much into what we're going to be discussing very soon. But do keep your thoughts flowing now. At the beginning of 2011, more than ever, email africa@presstv.co.uk and text +4478 0008 086. And of course, that ever-growing Facebook fan page is Africa Today, Press TV London. And as we mentioned in the first part of the show, conflict will take a long time to resolve. And we're going to move on in the second part of the show to discuss the Millennium Development Goals and how far Africa has succeeded towards achieving those. But first of all, we'll have a look at some of the concerns, particularly in Somalia and in the Sudan, with this report from Kofi Asamoah.
Africa faces huge challenges in eradicating poverty and restoring lasting peace on the continent. Moreover, it is not on target to meet any of the Millennium Development Goals which was set by the UN in 2000 and to be achieved by 2015. The problem in Somalia is proving to be the most difficult. According to Professor Abdu Samata of University of Minnesota, America, who created the conflict, and its ally Ethiopia, exacerbated the situation by their interference. Now, the former is backing the African Union force, largely made up of another American ally, Uganda. Another challenging issue Africa has to deal with is the referendum in Sudan. Sudan, the largest country in Africa, will be split into two if secession of the South on January 9th is successful. There are already speculations of a looming war whether the voting goes ahead or not. Questions still remain on Côte d'Ivoire's future with two men who see themselves as the rightful president. Is there an end to the growing challenges facing Africa?
Well, we hope to give a more optimistic outlook on what may happen, because we are constantly hearing about challenges in Africa, but there has been some progress. And we'll start with one of the biggest challenges facing the African continent as 2011 begins. If I could start with you, Togo. The situation in Somalia, indeed the whole Horn of Africa, hinges on what happens in that arena. What is your assessment about what is going to happen in this coming year? Are we going to come to a tipping point where something positive happens?
I'm very pessimistic about Somalia, I must say. And this is because there hasn't been a resolution of the interclan tensions that have described or characterized the conflict within Somalia itself. We've seen the imposition of a government, but it's not accepted by the majority of the clans within Somalia itself. Probably this suggestion that a form of a federal state would actually work for Somalia could be a solution. We've seen the independent Somaliland trying to do something positive out of the situation.
Right.
So that might be the way to go for the rest of Somalia.
Do you think Somalia will look at, as Toko said, the positive example of Somaliland, which has managed to remain relatively stable and is very close to Somalia? So can they not learn lessons from that situation, or do you think the intertribal clan dynamic is too big a hurdle?
I think, well, I would hope that they could learn from the Somaliland situation. My worry with Somalia is that there's quite a lot of interest in destabilizing that area.
From the West, are you saying? Where from?
I feel that, for instance, I still don't understand the interference of the push for Ethiopia to have been involved there, and now the push for Uganda to be involved there, especially at the time that the West is pulling away from Afghanistan and focusing on Somalia and the Yemen as being the Islamic states that they're actually focusing on. That, to me, doesn't give Somalia an opportunity to sit down and look internally at ways to sort out its own conflicts.
So how much of a factor is the alleged war on terror, which is used as a lot of justification for interference? How much of a factor do you think that will be in the coming year?
Well, it would definitely be a factor, and this is because some Somali groups have unequivocally identified themselves as being affiliated to Al-Qaeda. So there's always going to be the excuse for interference or backing one warlord over the other. And this is a problem for Somalia because what they need to get to is a point where the clans sit down and come up with a governance arrangement that is acceptable to all of them. Now, having this dynamic of the war on terror also operating within Somalia is going to delay that discussion.
And there's a very strong push to get the African Union, as Thandi was alluding, and other African states to become more involved in the situation. Do you think that's a good thing?
Well, I don't think military involvement is the best thing. I don't think that the Somali situation can be resolved by force. Ever since the state collapsed in the early 90s, attempts to put it back together using force have failed. And doing the same things is not going to result in a different answer. It's going to result in the same kind of dynamic that we've witnessed for the past 20 years.
Right.
Now, there's need to establish a political settlement. And how do you do that? It's by having a broad-based arrangement that incorporates everyone, including the Islamists, within governance.
Well, do you think they are managing to do that in Sudan, Sis Thandi? There's some analysts who think that this independence vote, this splitting, will actually bring war to the situation. Do you think that it could help resolve particularly the issues facing the people in the south who are deeply impoverished and have been for a long time?
Yes, I'm not sure the splitting is actually going to resolve the situation. Because I think the conflict in the first place had been about dominance. I mean, I can't imagine that the North is going to automatically give in to the split of the South. I am not sure. I don't know if there's any other solution. I don't have a kind of a very learned view of Sudan. But I still don't believe that the split will immediately. I think there could be a protracted conflict for some time.
Well, it's got all the ingredients that we've been talking about around the table. You know, we've got resources, which people are concerned about, huge amounts of resources. We've got the alleged Islamic, non-Islamic split, you know, with the North representing the Islamic element. And also the rogue leader, as described in the West, who's still got an ICC warrant hanging over his head. You know, so, I mean, there's a lot at play there, but ultimately, for a lot of people, there's a feeling that this is an opportunity for Sudanese to resolve this, you know, indigenous African versus Arab Islamic influence African dynamic that happens across the continent. Do you think they can do it?
I think 2011 is the momentous year for Sudan. The fact that a people have come to a resolution to determine their own destiny. I think that, in terms of Africa, is a great thing. Now, all indications are that the referendum is going to determine that the country splits. How that is managed depends on how the resources are shared. Right? Because the interest of the North is to ensure that they get a fair share of their oil interests. And I think that is a possibility.
And also the South, likewise, which has been getting an unfair share, according to some analysts.
Yes, and the South will want to assert its sovereignty over those resources.
Okay, but well, we literally have a minute to just have a quick look at the Millennium Development Goals. The target is 2015, so still a few years ago. And eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. I mean, what's your general feeling when you hear that statement, and how far do you think we've gotten in the last year?
There were things that were met up to about 2009. There were not a lot, but I do think that a lot of them have not been met.
No.
And we have a problem in Africa of political elitism, which and the greed then that goes with that. And there's less concentration on the need of the masses of the people.
Well, I mean, one of the great needs that needs to be dealt with apart from hunger, we're talking about promoting gender equality, another one improving maternal health, mortality of children, combating HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other disease. A final statement from you as you look at this potpourri of problems, as you look at 2011, what's your feeling?
Well, I've got a very optimistic feeling about the continent. There's good stories coming up. Rwanda, the majority of MPs are actually women. The majority of cabinet members are actually women.
It's coming.
In Malawi, the parties have made commitments to select at least 40%.
Well, Africa Today is going to continue looking at those forward-thinking and enacting states. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this first program in the new year. Thanks to all of you who've been sending comments. africa@presstv.co.uk is the email. Or if you prefer, you can text +44 7800 00806. Messages are charged at local operator rates. A big thank you to all of our guests, Dr. Togo Kaime and Thandiwe Makiwane. Thanks for watching. I'm Vuyiswa Ngobongwana. Henry will be back next week. But from today's team, it's bye for now.